Hey there.
Hi, how are you doing?
Fine, how are you?
I'm good, very well. I'm just waiting for the go ahead. Ok, there you go. Boa noite a todos, sejam bem-vindos a ler Olhos nos Olhos, uma iniciativa da Câmara Municipal de Oeiras e da Rede de Bibliotecas Nacionais Municipais de Oeiras, que conta com a produção executiva da Book Company. Do outro lado do ecrã tenho o prazer de estar acompanhado por Paolo Giordano, a quem saúdo e agradeço. Thank you, Paolo, for being here with us. It's a pleasure. We'll speak
Obrigado. Yeah, thank you.
We'll speak
My only
shortly.
word in Portuguese, of course.
Yeah, we'll speak shortly. But first, let me share with our viewers a few details about you and your work. Paulo Giordano nasceu em Turim em 1982, filho de um ginecologista e de uma professora de inglês. Tem uma irmã, Cecília, que é mais velha do que ele, 3 anos. Licenciou-se em Física na Universidade de Turim, onde ganhou uma bolsa de doutoramento em Física de Partículas. Em 2008, venceu o prêmio Strega pelo seu romance de estreia A Solidão dos Números Primos. Foi, de resto, o escritor mais jovem a ser galardoado com o prémio literário de maior prestígio em Itália. Tinha, então, 26 anos. O livro recebeu vários prémios, como o prémio Campiello Opera Prima, tendo sido traduzido em mais de 40 línguas. A Solidão dos Números Primos foi também adaptado ao cinema em 2010, assim é que é, pelo realizador Saverio Costanzo. Em Portugal, há ainda traduções dos livros Negro e Prata e, mais recentemente, Frente ao Contágio, ambos editados pela Relógio de Água. A ler Olhos nos Olhos é uma iniciativa que tem como parceiros a UCLA, União das Cidades Capitais de Língua Portuguesa, o Centro Nacional de Cultura em Portugal, a Livraria Martins Fontes no Brasil, Camões, Centro Cultural Português em Maputo, a Feira do Livro Filipossos no Brasil, Sempre um Papo no Brasil, também a Fliaraxá do Brasil, a Academia Cabo-Verdiana de Letras de Cabo Verde, ainda a PEN Guiné-Bissau, a Pusfácio brasileira, a Fundação Fernando Leite Couto de Moçambique, a Bienal do Livro de Pernambuco, no Brasil. Durante a conversa, façam-nos chegar as vossas perguntas para o Paulo Giordano através do Facebook. Paulo, welcome again. And sorry for this introduction in Portuguese. Our conversation will be in English because my Italian is, well, pretty bad. So let's move on in English, if you don't mind. Let me start by asking you about Frente ao Contágio, the book you wrote on the new coronavirus. You wrote from a privileged standpoint, which is a country badly hit by the pandemic, Italy, of course. How hard was it to keep the narrative flowing while the events were unfolding right before your eyes?
Well, it was a sadly privileged point of view. I wrote the book very early in the pandemic. I started it on February 29, and just a week before the first cluster of contagions had been found in Italy, in Vo Euganeo in the north. So, and I wrote the book in 5 days and nights. It was really a very hectic process. And I have to say that it was very clear to me at that point that the situation would become very bad because it was very visible in the numbers, basically. But the health emergency hadn't really started at that point. It was just in the beginning. So we were in those days that would come just a few weeks later, when we saw all those the counts of the dead people day by day rising and rising and reaching the thousands per day. And we were still quite far from the coffins being taken out from Bergamo, an image that was shocking for our country,
Everyone.
and I think for the whole Europe. Yeah. And so at that moment when I wrote the book, everything was still in the imagination. And this book is a lot about the imagination that it takes to face an epidemics and a situation like this. Because we should have learned that one of the most difficult things is to be in sync with the pandemic, with the epidemic as it develops, because we see consequences of what we do or don't do just a couple of weeks after, or even later on. So everything is about foreseeing things. And in that moment, people were not foreseeing anything. People were still talking, arguing. Even scientists were arguing. Some were saying, no, this is just a seasonal flu. There's no real danger. You're exaggerating the risk. And others were saying, beware, because this is big and it's gonna hit us very hard. But the population was really divided and confused, and that's why I wrote the book so fast, and I tried to write it as clearly as I could. I wanted to explain things to people.
And how prepared or badly prepared is the international community to deal with the pandemic of these proportions? You argue that this is not the first, nor the least, not even the most horrible pandemic. And yet it is arguably the quickest one to spread in a global scale, right?
Well, it's for sure the first one in this modern world. The first one that, it took the coronavirus less than a couple of months to reach every corner of the world, all countries in the world. And this is a direct measure of how connected we've become in the last decades. But at the same time, we didn't prove very efficient in dealing globally with this pandemic. I remember during the first wave, when Italy was already severely hit and we were counting the deaths, other countries in Europe, not Portugal, to be honest, because Portugal was quite efficient in the first wave of the pandemic, but many other countries, they reacted with the same disbelief that we had
The first place.
with respect to China. Yeah. So when something was happening in China, in Europe, we were saying, okay, it's their problem. We have to look out for Chinese people traveling, and we were acting in a very crazy way, as if the virus could only hit Chinese people somehow. And then we suddenly realized that it was among us, and it was big, and it was already widespread. But then the other countries, even our neighbor countries, they said, okay, there's an Italian situation, but there's never been an Italian situation. This has been a worldwide problem from the very beginning, but it took us a long time to frame it this way.
Do you plan to write an update version of that book after things settle down a little bit in Italy or elsewhere? Or was it just a one-off thing?
No, actually, I've kept on writing throughout the last months. I've never really stopped. this short essay, I would say it was the start of a process that's been going on and on. But I've been writing mainly articles for the newspapers. Some of them have been translated, but with articles it's always more difficult, as you know, because newspapers work day by day, and it's very hard to keep track with other countries in that sense. But to me, it's been a constant process, and somehow I've been monitoring all the different steps of this epidemic from different angles and perspective, because our behavior is changing so fast. Our comprehension of the problem is changing so fast, and there are always so many new things that we need to understand, that I've been basically doing this and not much more from the end of February until now. Yeah.
Okay. Do you think people in general learn something in dealing with this pandemic? Are there any valuable lessons that we can take from this pandemic? And if so, are we able to take those lessons seriously in a way that we don't repeat the mistakes that we've been making over the last few months?
Well, there are so many things that need to be learned, even in the long term. I mean, there is a short-term thinking of the epidemic, and there is a long-term thinking. The short-term thinking is the one that is drawing all our attention and efforts. So we want to get out of this as soon as possible and solve this, which is, of course, it's natural and comprehensible. But on the other hand, there is a long-term thinking which has much more to do with how and why we ended up like this in this pandemic, in this situation. It has to do with the structure of our civilization before the pandemic, and this is a very important thinking as well, but somehow it's not finding space in the public debate, because we're also focused on the present. And I've tried from the very beginning to leave out some sort of moralistic view of the virus. It's very easy to see this all as some sort of lesson to learn, or some sort of punishment that comes from above for our mistakes. But I don't want to give this importance to the virus. I'm trying to stick to a very scientific view of the things. I'm trying to be objective as I can. And if you ask me if we're really learning how to deal with this, even in the short term, well, this second wave, at least in Italy, is somehow shows somehow that we were really able to learn from what happened in the spring, because we found ourselves unprepared again, and during the summer, what really shocked me of the summer wasn't, of course, the fact that people wanted to get out and be free and gather. I think that was very healthy somehow, but the speed with which we seem to have forgotten everything that was quite shocking to me. I mean,
Mhm.
we had so many victims just a few weeks before, and then we found ourselves in some sort of big denial. And denial is the big problem of this second part of the epidemic, I think.
I'm actually
I don't know
glad.
how it is in Portugal, but denial here has become a big issue for dealing with it now.
Yeah, it's gaining momentum as we speak, that denial in Portugal. So it's a big problem. And I'm actually glad that you mentioned the importance of science in dealing with, well, a pandemic, as opposed to have like a denial standpoint. Because I wanted to ask you, do you see yourself primarily as a scientist who writes books, or the other way around?
Well, I don't practice science anymore, and it's been
Mm-hmm.
now 10 years. So I'm out of that world, but it's my background. It's my main background. So I think I call myself a writer in the first place, of course. That's what I do. I write most of my time. But I'm very interested in science, in the sciences. This is something that uh, on one hand, I lost something when I moved out of science because I'm not able anymore to read a scientific paper, a very detailed scientific paper in the field that I used to study. But what I had in return of that is that now I can be interested in all disciplines, in all different sciences, as I wasn't uh, during my years at university. So I do read a lot, and science somehow is always the starting point, even of the novels that I write.
Mm-hmm. I have a question here by a viewer, Paulo Pereira, who asks, you told El País that after a great collective trauma, we tend to forget as an instinct. Is it possible to forget such a thing like COVID-19 much more than a collective trauma?
Well, apparently yes, and it's very easy to forget it, and we're very quick and efficient at it. Uh, I think that will be the role of some writers in the future. Writers are, to me, are often those people who cannot forget, who have a problem with memory because they cannot forget some things. So uh, some of the writers will have the role of keeping that memory alive. And this is very different in that sense from a war. We often call this a war because there
Yeah.
are similarities, but there are also differences. And one of the differences to me is that a war um, is hits our imagination stronger.
Mm-hmm.
This pandemic is very easy to be forgotten because it happens close to us, but for most of us, it's just like a bother, a problem in the everyday life. Okay, we need to be locked down, we have a curfew, we need to be tested, and maybe our kids have come into contact with someone, so we need to quarantine. So it's a problem. And then we hear of someone who's been sick, even of someone who's died, and maybe someone close to us. But it's very easy to normalize
Mm-hmm.
this, and the things happen in hospitals far away from our eyes somehow. So I think we have a problem to feel this. In a war, there is this like an enemy, a struggle, really something that you need to overcome. Here is very difficult. It's very easy to feel divided and just at some point not to care that much about what's happening. And I think that's not fair, because I mean, many people are dying, many people are suffering, and many people are doing big sacrifices. And this is going to change things, whether we like it or not.
Mm-hmm. Can we go back? I wanted to pull the scientific string here, if you don't mind. Can we go back in time a little bit to your most recognized books, so we can so you can explain once and for all what a prime number is? And of course, I'm referring to a solidão dos números primos.
Well, a prime number is a number that is divisible only by itself and by 1. So, well, we all know them, no? 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, so on and so forth. And you see, when you were asking me if I feel more like a scientist or more like a writer, when my life was mainly not in words, but in numbers and calculations, I used to give numbers a very defined shape and meaning, even a personality. And the whole idea behind that title and those 2 characters comes from this, from the fact that whenever you spend a lot of time in a place that's very lonely and not populated, like physics, theoretical physics and maths, then you find your own companion. And my own companion there were numbers and particles and all those things.
Actually, the analogy...
I still feel like a nerd.
The analogy between 2 human beings, Alice and Mattia, and these special numbers, these prime numbers, is extraordinary. How did you come up with this analogy? Was that a result of your work as a physic, like in the world of physics? Were you feeling alone doing your scientific work, and you had to, in some sense, give some personality to those numbers?
Well, you know, math is a language to me. It's basically a language, like Italian, like Portuguese. And if you learn to speak that language, then there are some things that you can say very precisely, and some other things that cannot be fully translated into other languages. You know, we also have those words that don't have an exact translation. There is the famous word in Portuguese, saudade, or however you pronounce it, that doesn't have an exact explanation in any other language. So we know it in its original form, and we use it in its original form. And the same happens in math. So there are things that happen there and that can be said with that code that cannot be exactly translated. And that problem in translation, to me, is the source of metaphors. You can build beautiful metaphors using science, because science has so many beautiful words, complicated and beautiful words that cannot be translated exactly, and concepts. And prime numbers and twin prime numbers, which are sort of couples of prime numbers that stand very close to each other, were one of those ideas that I just had into my mind. And when I was writing about these two lonely characters, at some point the analogy just came to me, or it came to the mind of my character, because Mattia in that novel often conceives of the reality in terms of calculations, because it's a way to calm him down. And that happens to me as well. I used to use math as a form to calm down.
Okay. I have another question by probably your biggest fan watching here in Portugal, Paulo Pereira again. And this question kind of overlaps with my previous question, but probably you'll have something to add to the question. About the solitude of prime numbers, how did you come up with that story of fear and fear of living and fear of loving? And also about the difficult times of adolescence.
Well, it's very hard for me now to go back to the real
the roots.
Original idea of the book, because so many years have passed, and books are not just as they not stay as they are throughout time, but they somehow change with you, and your perspective on the stories you've written changes with you. But I wrote The Solitude of Prime Numbers when I was still very close to my formative years, so to my years as a teenager. I was just out of that part of life, so it felt all very vivid and close. And I guess I would tell those years as years of loneliness.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, doesn't mean that I was lonely because I didn't have friends or whatever, but they just felt lonely, even with people. And I think it's very common, and it's a universal thing that even teenagers of today can relate to. Yeah.
Okay. The questions keep coming up. I have another one by Rita França Ferreira, who asks how different it is to write this last book that is related with something that was occurring at the same time you were writing, and your novels, such as The Solitude of Prime Numbers.
How Contagion works was a radical new experience for me. I had never written something so unexpected, so not planned, and so fast. I knew I didn't have time. I didn't have more than a few days to finish it, because it was very clear that Italy would soon be in a lockdown. So there was a practical problem for the book to be published, because very soon the publishers weren't able anymore to publish books. So I had to be fast, and I knew it. And that was completely new. I couldn't. I'm usually a very slow writer. I tend to think over things over and over, even too much. But I just didn't have time to think, and what was happening around me just seemed so much more important than any of my doubts and worries. So I just did it. And it felt good, actually, in that situation, because it felt as if I was doing my small part in that process. But after months of this, after months of just observing realities and reacting to reality and trying to process things as they happen, I really feel the need of going back to that slowness of writing novels. And that's what I plan to do very soon. Like, try to close this chapter, even if it won't be closed, but I'll try to do it to go back to a different pace. You know what? That's really what I like about being a novelist, that you can keep a pace that is different from the pace of the outside world, from the pace of other things that is usually much faster and where everything burns much faster.
What can you tell us about the future novel or the future book that you'll write? Is it?
I wish I had something to tell.
No,
I haven't written a single word.
Okay. Apart
but
from
I
your
do
name.
have a couple of images. And I usually rely a lot on images, on visions, and I respect them a lot. So I'll try to explore around them and see what happens.
I have another question by one beloved viewer of this conversation, but I'll try to squeeze in a question of mine, because you write an awful lot about solitude and abandonment. That is again the case with Negro y Prata, the story of an experienced couple. It immediately comes to my mind the first line of Love Will Tear Us Apart, the Joy Division song, which kicks off with "When Routine Bites Hard." You love the song?
Yes.
Okay, that's good to know. Do you think?
And there is a beautiful version that just came out by the National. If you haven't listened to it,
I'll definitely listen to that right after we finish our conversation. But do you think this applies to Nora and her husband, or is it a stretch that I did just here?
As you said, I tend to write a lot about loneliness. I don't know why. My life is apparently better than that, but loneliness is very interesting to me. And that book is about a peculiar kind of loneliness, because I think we can experience loneliness not only as individual people, but also as groups of people, or for instance, as a couple, as a married couple, like the one that's in the book. I've built a family in the years when I wrote that book. I had just built my present family, and it's been a tough process, because it's not been very linear, I would say. So my wife came from another marriage. She had 2 kids from her previous marriage, and she was going through a divorce with all the struggles and the violence that a divorce always brings in. And so I was in this process, and I was trying to keep everything together. And I mean, not everyone around us was supportive. Basically, very few people were supportive. So it often happened to us to feel lonely together in this thing. And that story, and there was one person the protagonist of that novel, that was instead very close to us and not judgmental at all. And then she became sick, and the book is basically about her last year of life. And when she died, we felt even more lonely because we were missing her support. So that's what the book is about. It's about how hard it can be sometimes just to be, even to be two people who love each other in the world.
Mm-hmm. Routine is a huge part of any scientific work. I don't know whether or not you agree with this, but the same I think applies with love and relationships. Is there any chance of achieving an eureka moment in a relationship?
Say it again. What kind of moment?
Eureka.
Well, there are many,
Mm-hmm.
but sometimes they are so unexpected and so marginal, they just happen, and and I think it's very important to become sensitive to the vibrations, small vibrations, because we can have big moments of happiness and accomplishment and union, but more often I think it happens in very subtle movements, very non-extraordinary moments, and it takes some effort to recognize them and just take care of them.
Mm-hmm.
Not to waste them. I'm not very good at it, honestly, but I do my best.
Okay, fair enough. So the question that was here waiting in line is by Paulo Ferreira, and he says, in a parallel world, you can discover the theory of everything, or you can win the Nobel Prize in literature. Which one do you choose?
It's very difficult, but I still think I would like to discover a fundamental law of nature more than everything. Something that bears my name, like the constant of. That's always been my. It just sounds so. You cannot question it somehow.
Mm-hmm. And then you can.
It will never happen, as the other case will never happen. So,
but if
whatever I choose is fine.
And if you did accomplish in a parallel world, that discovery, you could then write a book and win the Nobel Prize. So
that's right. So it sounds strategic. It's a win-win situation.
It is. Okay, thank you so much, Paolo, for joining us for this brief conversation.
Thank you, Elder.
And we share the same birth date, birth year. And you have, I was just mentioning this off the record before we came live. And you have accomplished so many things. And I can only envy you and wish you all the best with your future, projects and books and whatnot. Thank you so much.
Next time we'll do this again in presence in Lisbona.
Yes.
Hopefully.
Or in Italy. Why not?
Or in Italy. Yeah.
Okay. You choose the city and I'll go there.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Pleasure. Thank you very much. Muito obrigado também a todos os que acompanharam esta sessão. Isto foi muito rápido. Havia tantas outras perguntas que gostaríamos todos de ter feito ao Paolo Giordano. O Ler Olhos nos Olhos regressa no dia 25 de novembro com o Frederico Lourenço, uma conversa que terá a moderação de Francisco José Viegas. Até lá, então, fiquem atentos ao Ler Olhos nos Olhos. E mais uma vez, muito obrigado. Thank you, Paolo. See you next time.
Obrigado. Ciao. Ciao to everybody.